The emergency room at Central Hospital was running smoothly under Dr. Marcus Reyes's experienced watch when the double doors burst open. Two police officers stumbled in, one supporting the other, who was gasping for breath, his face alarmingly swollen. "He needs help," Officer Wilson shouted, half dragging his partner. "Where's the doctor? Get me a real doctor now." Dr. Reyes moved swiftly toward them, his practiced eye already assessing the situation. "I'm Dr. Reyes, Chief of Emergency Medicine. Let's get him to—" "I said a real doctor." Wilson blocked his path, physically pushing the Filipino doctor back. "Not whatever you are. Get me someone qualified." The partner, Officer Chen, wheezed harder, his throat visibly constricting. Dr. Reyes noticed the half-eaten sandwich in his hand, spotted the telltale signs. "Sir, your partner is having a severe anaphylactic reaction." Dr. Reyes remained calm, even as Wilson continued blocking him. "Every second delayed increases the risk. I need to treat him now." "Like hell you will." Wilson's face reddened. "For all I know, you're some foreign impersonator. I want a qualified American doctor." Other staff froze, watching the scene unfold. Dr. Reyes could see Officer Chen's condition deteriorating rapidly. "Officer Wilson," Dr. Reyes's voice carried quiet authority, "in approximately 30 seconds, your partner's airway will close completely. You can either let me save his life, or you can explain to his family why your prejudice killed him." Wilson hesitated, looking between his struggling partner and the Filipino doctor he refused to trust. "Your choice," Dr. Reyes added calmly, "but make it now." Chen's knees buckled as his oxygen depleted. Wilson's resistance crumbled. "Fine," he growled, "but if anything happens—" Dr. Reyes was already moving, catching Chen before he fell. With practiced efficiency, he lifted the officer onto a gurney. "Anaphylaxis, likely shellfish," he called out to his team. "Standard protocol plus combat kit 3. His hands moved with surgical precision, implementing techniques perfected under far worse conditions than an angry cop's glare. Within minutes, Chen's breathing eased as the treatment took effect. How did you know it was shellfish?" Wilson demanded, still suspicious, but shaken by how quickly Dr. Reyes had stabilized his partner. "The sandwich in his hand, shrimp salad," Dr. Reyes replied, while monitoring Chen's vitals. "Plus, the speed and severity of the reaction. I've seen it countless times, especially in the field." "The field?" Chen spoke weakly, his breathing improving. "You were military?" "Combat surgeon, 3rd Special Forces, 8 years in the worst zones you can imagine." Dr. Reyes checked Chen's oxygen levels. "Funny thing about combat medicine. You learn to work fast, even when people don't trust you." Wilson's face shifted as the implications hit him. He'd just spent 10 minutes blocking a decorated military surgeon from saving his partner's life, based purely on race. "The combat kit you mentioned," Chen said, recognition dawning in his eyes. "You're Doc Ray, the miracle medic from Kandahar." "Doctor." Reyes simply nodded, continuing his work, but Wilson's face had drained of color. "Doc Ray, the one who saved that entire unit under heavy fire?" Wilson's voice had lost all its previous aggression. "The surgeon who performed emergency surgery in a cave with a flashlight." "Among other things," Dr. Reyes replied calmly. "Now, Officer Chen needs rest. We can discuss my qualifications later if you still have doubts about them." As Dr. Reyes turned to leave, Wilson grabbed his arm, but this time there was no hostility in the gesture. "Doctor, I don't know what to say. I almost got my partner killed because you assumed a Filipino couldn't be a qualified doctor," Dr. Reyes finished. "Let's hope you remember this moment next time you're tempted to judge someone by their appearance." He left Wilson standing there, the weight of his prejudice-driven actions sinking in. The cop who'd tried to block an unqualified foreign doctor had nearly caused his partner's death by interfering with one of the most decorated combat surgeons in military history. 2 hours later, Wilson sat by his partner's hospital bed, the weight of guilt crushing him as he scrolled through article after article about Dr. Reyes on his phone. 3 bronze stars, silver star, presidential unit citation. Wilson read quietly. Performed surgery during an active firefight, saved 43 soldiers in 1 day. He's a legend in special forces, Chen said, his voice stronger now. Every combat medic knows about Doc Ray. There's a whole chapter about his techniques. In our training manual, the door opened, and Dr. Reyes entered to check Chen's vitals. Wilson stood quickly, his earlier arrogance replaced by shame. Doctor, I need to apologize properly, Wilson started. What I did was potentially fatal to your partner. Dr. Reyes finished, checking Chen's charts. Yes, it was, but that's not the worst part. What do you mean? I'm not special, officer. Wilson, I'm just one of many highly qualified doctors who happen to be minorities. The worst part is wondering how many other medical professionals you've disrespected, how many patients might have suffered because of similar prejudices. Chen spoke up. Doc, there's something else you should know. Remember that cave surgery you performed in Kandahar? The soldier with shrapnel in his chest? Dr. Reyes nodded, still focusing on the medical charts. That was my brother, Chen revealed. Our family never knew who the surgeon was, just that some miracle doctor saved him in impossible conditions. Mike still has your combat bandage, says it's his lucky charm. For the first time, Dr. Reyes's professional composure cracked slightly. Michael Chen, the young sergeant with the photo of his baby daughter? She's starting college next month, Chen smiled. Because you didn't let prejudice stop you from saving lives, even under fire. Wilson sank back into his chair, the full impact of his actions hitting him. His racism hadn't just nearly killed his partner. He'd tried to prevent a surgeon, one who had already saved his partner's brother from doing his job. How do you do it? Wilson asked quietly. How do you keep helping people who treat you like I did? Because unlike you, Officer Wilson, Dr. Reyes replied, I don't judge people by their appearance or background. I judge them by their actions and their capacity to learn from mistakes. He turned to leave, then paused. Your partner needs rest, but if you're serious about learning from this, come back tomorrow. I'm giving a training session for emergency responders. You might find it educational. As Dr. Reyes left, Wilson looked at his partner. I really messed up, didn't I? Yeah, Chen agreed, but you've got a chance to do better. That's more than my brother would have had if Doc Ray had let prejudice stop him in that cave. Wilson stared at his phone, at the countless articles about the doctor he'd tried to dismiss. The Filipino surgeon he'd tried to block hadn't just saved his partner. He'd been saving lives under far worse conditions than Wilson could imagine. The next morning, Wilson arrived early for Dr. Reyes's training session, taking a seat in the back of the hospital's conference room. Other emergency responders filled in, many greeting the doctor with obvious respect. Today's topic, Dr. Reyes began, is emergency response in hostile conditions. Sometimes the hostility comes from the environment. Sometimes, his eyes met Wilson's briefly, it comes from people who should be allies. For the next hour, Dr. Reyes shared stories from his military service, each one teaching vital lessons about performing under pressure. Wilson listened, increasingly, amazed at the situations this doctor had handled. In combat, Dr. Reyes explained, you learn quickly that prejudice kills. When bullets are flying, you don't care about the medic's race or background. You care about their skills. He pulled up a photo of a dark cave, medical supplies scattered around a makeshift operating area. Wilson heard Chen's sharp intake of breath. This was where his brother's life had been saved. This patient had shrapnel near his heart, Dr. Reyes continued. No proper lighting, minimal equipment, enemy fire outside. But he survived because no one in that cave cared what their surgeon looked like. They only cared that he could do his job. After the session, Wilson approached Dr. Reyes. Other emergency responders were sharing their own stories, thanking the doctor for his service. "I've been a cop for 15 years, Wilson said when the others had left. "Thought I'd seen everything. But yesterday, my prejudice nearly killed my partner, nearly stopped you from saving him, just like you saved his brother." "And what did you learn?" Dr. Reyes asked quietly. "That I've been wrong. Dangerously wrong. All these years, letting assumptions cloud my judgment, maybe stopping good people from helping others. Recognition is the first step," Dr. Reyes nodded, "but what matters is what you do next." Wilson straightened. "I want to make it right, not just apologize, but actually change things. Would you be willing to help train our department? Share these stories? Help other officers see what I saw?" Dr. Reyes studied him for a long moment. "You realize that means admitting to your fellow officers what happened yesterday, telling them how your prejudice nearly had fatal consequences." "Yes," Wilson replied firmly. "They need to hear it. I need to tell it. Because next time, the person being prejudged might be someone like you, someone whose skills could mean the difference between life and death." Dr. Reyes extended his hand. "Then we have work to do, Officer Wilson. Because unfortunately, your reaction yesterday wasn't unique, but your willingness to learn from it, that could help change things." As they shook hands, Wilson realized how completely his perspective had shifted. The Filipino doctor he'd tried to dismiss was now going to help him become a better officer. "A better person, thank you," Wilson said quietly, "not just for saving my partner, but for being willing to help me fix what's wrong in myself." "That's what doctors do, Officer Wilson." Dr. Reyes smiled slightly. "We heal what's broken. Sometimes it's bodies, sometimes it's minds, and sometimes it's prejudices that have been allowed to fester for far too long." A week later, Wilson stood before his entire police department, his heart pounding as he prepared to share his story. Dr. Reyes sat quietly in the back, there to support the officer's first step toward real change. "I almost got my partner killed," Wilson began, his voice shaking slightly. "Not because of a shooter, not because of a chase, but because of my own prejudice." The room fell silent as Wilson recounted that night in the ER, how he'd blocked a highly decorated combat surgeon from saving his partner, all because he couldn't believe a Filipino could be a qualified doctor. "And that's not even the worst part," Wilson continued. "Officer Chen's brother, the soldier with the lucky bandage from Kandahar, that was Dr. Reyes too. My prejudice almost stopped the same man who'd already saved part of our police family." Dr. Reyes watched as Wilson's fellow officers absorbed this information. Some looked shocked, others uncomfortable, recognizing their own potential biases. "But I'm not here just to confess," Wilson straightened. "I'm here because Dr. Reyes offered to help us do better, to share his experiences, train us to recognize and overcome these dangerous prejudices." The chief stepped forward. "Dr. Reyes, would you like to add anything?" Dr. Reyes walked to the front, his presence commanding immediate respect. "In combat, prejudice gets people killed. In emergency rooms, prejudice gets people killed. And on the streets, officers letting prejudice cloud their judgment, that gets people killed too." He shared brief snippets of his military experience, times when trust and cooperation across all backgrounds had saved lives. The officers listened intently, particularly the veterans among them who recognized the situations he described. "Officer Wilson's courage today," Dr. Reyes concluded, "admitting his mistake and working to fix it, that's how real change starts. One person facing their prejudice and choosing to be better." As the session ended, officers lined up to thank both Wilson and Dr. Reyes. Many shared their own stories of times when assumptions might have clouded their judgment. "This isn't just about one night in the ER anymore, is it?" Wilson asked Dr. Reyes quietly. "It never was," Dr. Reyes replied. "But watching you turn your mistake into a catalyst for change, that's the best medicine I could have prescribed." 2 weeks after Wilson's presentation, Michael Chen, Officer Chen's brother, walked into the ER. He'd flown in specifically to meet the surgeon who'd saved him in that cave years ago. "Doc Ray," Michael said, voice thick with emotion, pulling out a worn combat bandage from his pocket. "I've been carrying this for years, never knowing who to thank." Dr. Reyes recognized his own hasty signature on the bandage, written by flashlight in that dark cave. "You kept it all this time. It's my daughter's good luck charm now," Michael smiled. "She's starting medical school next month. Wants to be just like the mystery doctor who saved her dad." Wilson, who'd come to witness the reunion, watched as Dr. Reyes and Michael shared memories of that night in Kandahar. The cave, the firefight outside, the makeshift surgery that had seemed impossible. "I remember thinking," Michael said, "that I didn't care who saved me or where they were from. I just wanted to live to see my baby girl grow up. And now she's becoming a doctor." Dr. Reyes nodded. "Life has a way of coming full circle." "That's actually why I'm here." Michael turned serious. "Would you consider mentoring her? She specifically wants to learn combat medicine to help others like you helped me." Dr. Reyes glanced at Wilson, a slight smile playing at his lips. "Interesting how prejudice could have broken this circle, isn't it? If your brother's partner had succeeded in stopping me from working that night in the ER..." Wilson stepped forward. "But instead, it created a new circle. Your story, your willingness to teach us. It's changing how our whole department thinks and acts." "The best kind of medicine," Dr. Reyes said quietly, "doesn't just heal wounds. It prevents them from happening in the first place." As they talked, more hospital staff gathered, listening to Michael share stories about Dr. Reyes's legendary service. The Filipino Dr. Wilson had tried to dismiss was being revealed as more extraordinary with each tale. "You're not just changing the police department," Wilson realized. "You're changing the next generation of doctors too." A month after Michael's visit, Dr. Reyes watched proudly as Wilson led a training session for new police recruits. The officer who'd once blocked him from treating a patient was now teaching others about the dangers of prejudice in emergency response. "When I almost got my partner killed," Wilson told the recruits, "I learned that prejudice doesn't just hurt the people we judge. It hurts everyone around us too." Dr. Reyes stepped forward to share more of his experiences, but this time, something was different. The recruits had already heard stories about him. His legend had spread through the department. "Thanks to Officer Wilson's honesty," Dr. Reyes explained, "we've created a new training program. Police and medical staff working together, learning to check their biases before they become fatal mistakes." Chen, fully recovered, joined them to share his perspective. "I nearly died because of prejudice. But more importantly, I learned that changing those prejudices can save lives." During a break, Wilson pulled Dr. Reyes aside. "Remember what you asked me that first morning? About what I'd learned?" "I remember. I learned that heroes don't always look like what we expect," Wilson said quietly. "And sometimes the people we judge most harshly are the ones who end up saving us all." Dr. Reyes smiled. "And I learned that sometimes the strongest prejudices, when broken, create the strongest advocates for change." As they watched the recruits practice new protocols for emergency response, both men realized how far they'd come from that tense night in the ER. The Filipino Dr. Wilson had tried to stop, had not only saved his partner's life, he'd helped save Wilson's soul. "You know what the best part is?" Wilson mused. "Every time I start to judge someone now, I remember that night. I remember how wrong I was about you, and I choose to be better." "That," Dr. Reyes nodded, "is the best medicine of all." 2 months after the training program began, the police department organized a special ceremony. What started as Wilson's personal redemption had grown into something much bigger. "Today, we honor not just Dr. Reyes's military service," the chief announced, but his courage in turning one officer's prejudice into a force for change. Wilson stood proudly beside Dr. Reyes as the chief presented a special commendation. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The officer who'd once blocked him from saving a life was now celebrating his impact. "But there's more," the chief continued. "Michael Chen's daughter isn't the only one Dr. Reyes inspired. 5 of our officers' children have now applied to medical school, all because of his example." Dr. Reyes listened, moved, as Wilson stepped up to speak. "A few months ago, I almost got my partner killed because I judged a hero by his appearance. Today, that same hero is teaching us all to be better." The ceremony was interrupted by emergency sirens. A major accident nearby needed immediate response. Without hesitation, Dr. Reyes and Wilson rushed out together, the doctor and the officer who'd once been adversaries now working as one. At the accident scene, officers who'd been through their training program smoothly integrated with medical staff. No prejudices, no assumptions, just professionals working together to save lives. "See that?" Wilson said quietly to Dr. Reyes between helping victims. "That's your real commendation right there. That's what change looks like." Dr. Reyes watched as his 2 worlds merged. His military precision, guiding civilian emergency response, his ability to heal extending beyond just physical wounds. "No," he replied, "that's what redemption looks like." 3 months after the ceremony, Dr. Reyes's ER shift was interrupted by unexpected visitors. A group of veterans, all in full military dress, had traveled from across the country after hearing about Wilson's story on the news. Doc Ray, their leader, Captain James Morrison, stepped forward. "And when we heard some cop tried to stop you from saving lives because you're Filipino, well, we had to come show everyone exactly who they disrespected." Wilson, who was visiting the ER for a training session, watched in awe as veteran after veteran shared their stories. Each one had been saved by Dr. Reyes in seemingly impossible conditions. "That cave in Kandahar," Master Sergeant Thompson spoke up. "Doc operated on me the day before Chen's brother. No anesthesia, no proper equipment, just his steady hands and calm voice talking me through it. Kept me alive while mortars were dropping outside." Lieutenant Rodriguez stepped forward. "Baghdad, 2015. Our unit was pinned down, multiple casualties. Doc Ray ran through enemy fire 5 times to drag wounded soldiers to safety, then performed surgery right there in the kill zone. 7 hours straight, bullets flying overhead." Wilson listened, each story making him more ashamed of his previous prejudice. The doctor he'd tried to dismiss as unqualified had more combat medical experience than most military hospitals combined. "Want to know something funny?" Sergeant Miller addressed Wilson directly. "First time I saw Doc Ray, I had the same reaction." "You did? Couldn't believe this Filipino guy was our combat surgeon. 10 minutes later, he was elbow deep in my chest, keeping my heart beating while our position was being overrun." The ER staff gathered around, listening to tales of their chief's heroism they'd never known about. Dr. Reyes remained humble, focusing on checking charts and patient care even as his incredible past was revealed. 3 bronze stars, Captain, Morrison continued. Silver Star, 2 Purple Hearts, more combat surgeries than any doctor in Special Forces history. And some cop thought he wasn't qualified enough? Wilson stepped forward. "You're right. I let prejudice blind me to everything Dr. Reyes is. Almost got my partner killed because I couldn't see past my own bias." "But you learned," Dr. Reyes spoke, up quietly. "And you're helping others learn. That's why these men are really here, not just to share stories, but to support what we're building." Captain Morrison nodded. "We're starting a program. Veterans working with police departments nationwide, sharing stories like these, showing how prejudice gets people killed in combat, in hospitals, on the streets." "Because what happened that night in the ER," Lieutenant Rodriguez added, That kind of prejudice doesn't just hurt the people being judged, it hurts everyone who might need their help. Dr. Reyes watched as his two worlds merged, his military past and his civilian present coming together to create real change. The prejudice that had almost stopped him from saving Wilson's partner was now becoming a tool for transformation. "You didn't just save us in combat, Doc," Captain Morrison concluded. "You're still saving lives by teaching people like Officer Wilson to see past their prejudices. And we're here to help tell that story." The ER fell silent as the impact of their words sank in. The Filipino Dr. Wilson had tried to block from treating his partner wasn't just a qualified physician, he was a legendary combat surgeon whose experience in saving lives under the worst conditions imaginable made him uniquely qualified to save lives here at home. "I learned something in combat," Dr. Reyes finally said. "When bullets are flying and lives are on the line, prejudice becomes a luxury no one can afford. Maybe we need to start treating all emergencies that way." Wilson nodded, understanding deeper now than ever before. The night he'd let prejudice cloud his judgment, he hadn't just disrespected a doctor, he disrespected a hero who had saved countless lives in conditions Wilson could barely imagine. A week after the veteran's visit, the story of Dr. Reyes and Officer Wilson had gone viral. News crews gathered outside the hospital as other police departments nationwide requested their training program. "It's not just about my military record," Dr. Reyes explained to reporters. "It's about what Officer Wilson's transformation proves, that prejudice can be overcome when people are willing to learn from their mistakes." Wilson stood beside him, no longer ashamed to be associated with the story. "I almost got my partner killed because I couldn't believe a Filipino could be a qualified doctor. Instead, I blocked a legendary combat surgeon from saving a life." The hospital lobby was filled with police officers from other cities, all wanting to learn from their experience. Each one had their own stories of times when prejudice might have clouded their judgment. "Tell them about Baghdad," Captain Morrison urged, still in town to support the program. "Tell them what real qualification looks like." Dr. Reyes quietly shared the story, how he'd performed surgery in the middle of a firefight, using his own body to shield his patient from bullets, how race and prejudice meant nothing when lives were at stake. "In combat," he explained, "you learn quickly that skill and courage don't care about race, the bullets don't discriminate, and neither can we if we want to save lives." Wilson added his perspective. "When I stopped Dr. Reyes from treating my partner, I wasn't just disrespecting him. I was disrespecting every life he'd saved in combat, every soldier who trusted him with their life." The cameras rolled as other veterans arrived to share their stories. Each one had been saved by Dr. Reyes in seemingly impossible conditions. Each one proved how deadly prejudice could be. "You want to know what makes Doc Ray qualified?" Sergeant Miller addressed the gathered officers. "Try performing surgery in a cave with nothing but a flashlight. Try saving lives while bullets are flying overhead. Try running through enemy fire to reach wounded soldiers." Dr. Reyes remained humble, focusing on current patients even as his past heroics were revealed. His actions spoke louder than any words could. "This isn't about making anyone feel guilty," he told the officers. "It's about understanding that prejudice doesn't just hurt the person being judged. It hurts everyone who might need their help." Wilson watched as his fellow officers absorbed these lessons. The Filipino doctor he'd tried to dismiss was teaching them all how to be better protectors of their communities. "The night I let prejudice cloud my judgment," Wilson shared, "I wasn't just wrong about Dr. Reyes. I was wrong about what makes someone qualified to save lives, dead wrong, and my partner almost paid the price." News helicopters circled as more veterans arrived to support the program. The story of the prejudiced cop and the Filipino combat surgeon was becoming a catalyst for change across the nation. "Every time you judge someone by their appearance, Dr. Reyes concluded. Remember this, somewhere they might have a cave full of wounded soldiers in their past. They might have saved lives under conditions you can't imagine. Or they might just be qualified professionals who deserve respect. The impact of their story was spreading beyond just police and medical services. It was becoming a lesson about how prejudice endangers everyone and how recognizing and correcting it could save lives. 1 month after their story went viral, Wilson stood before the National Police Chiefs Conference. With Dr. Reyes beside him, he shared how prejudice had almost cost his partner's life. "I thought I was protecting my partner," Wilson admitted to the packed auditorium. "Instead, I almost killed him by stopping a combat-decorated surgeon from treating him, all because I couldn't believe a Filipino could be that qualified." Dr. Reyes then took the stage, but not to share war stories. Instead, he talked about the everyday heroes being overlooked because of prejudice. "Officer Wilson's story went viral because of my military background," he explained. "But what about all the other qualified professionals being judged by their appearance? How many lives are being put at risk by these prejudices?" The chiefs listened intently as Wilson described their new training program, how veterans were working with police departments to show the deadly cost of prejudice in emergency situations. "Remember," Dr. Reyes added, "I didn't need my combat experience to be qualified that night. Being a board-certified emergency physician was qualification enough. The military background just makes the prejudice more obviously wrong." Captain Morrison and other veterans joined them on stage, each sharing moments when setting aside prejudice. Had saved lives in combat. "You know what's powerful about their story?" Morrison addressed the chiefs. "It's not just about a cop learning to respect a decorated combat surgeon. It's about learning to respect everyone's qualifications, regardless of their appearance." Wilson nodded. "Every time I start to make assumptions now, I remember that night. I remember how wrong I was about Dr. Reyes, and I wonder how many other qualified professionals I might have misjudged." The conference hall was silent as body camera footage played, showing Wilson blocking Dr. Reyes from treating his partner. The contrast between that moment and their current partnership was stark. "This is what change looks like," Dr. Reyes told the chiefs. "Not just recognizing past mistakes, but actively working to prevent future ones." Officer Wilson turned his prejudice into a teaching tool. Department after department signed up for their training program. The story of the prejudiced cop and the Filipino combat surgeon was becoming a standard part of police training nationwide. "But remember," Wilson emphasized, "Dr. Reyes shouldn't have needed a chest full of combat medals to earn respect. His medical degree and experience were enough. My prejudice was wrong from the start." As the conference ended, chiefs from across the country approached them. Each wanted to know how to implement similar changes in their departments. "The hardest part," Wilson told them, "is admitting how wrong we can be, how prejudice can blind us to the qualified professionals right in front of us." Dr. Reyes watched as his partner's transformation inspired others. The officer who had once blocked him from saving a life was now helping save countless others by teaching police to see past their prejudices. 2 months after the police chiefs' conference, Dr. Reyes and Wilson received a special invitation to the White House. Their story had sparked a national conversation about prejudice in emergency services. "Your partnership shows us something important," the president said during the ceremony. "It shows us that recognizing and correcting our prejudices isn't just about being politically correct. It's about saving lives." Wilson stood proudly beside Dr. Reyes as they received the Presidential Citizens Medal. The officer who had once blocked a Filipino doctor from saving his partner was now being honored for helping transform police training nationwide. "But there's something else you should know," Dr. Reyes revealed during his acceptance speech. "Since our story went public, applications from minority students to medical schools have increased by 40%. Officer Wilson's honest admission, of prejudice is helping create the next generation of doctors. The ceremony was interrupted by an urgent call, a major emergency at a nearby federal building. Without hesitation, Dr. Reyes and Wilson rushed to help, their partnership now seamless. At the scene, they found other police officers already working smoothly with minority medical professionals. Their story had already changed how emergency services operated. "See that?" Wilson pointed to a young Filipino doctor efficiently directing emergency response. "6 months ago, I might have questioned his qualifications. Today, I only see a qualified professional saving lives." Dr. Reyes watched as his impact spread beyond just one officer's transformation. The prejudice that had almost stopped him from saving Wilson's partner was now being systematically eliminated from emergency services. "You know what's remarkable?" Captain Morrison, who had attended the ceremony, observed. "It's not just about police learning to respect combat veterans. It's about learning to respect everyone's qualifications, regardless of their background." The emergency was handled perfectly, with no prejudice-based delays or questioning of credentials. The system was learning from Wilson's mistake. "This is your real legacy," Wilson told Dr. Reyes as they watched the efficient emergency response. "Not just the lives you saved in combat, but all the lives that will be saved because prejudice no longer delays treatment." The White House ceremony had recognized their past achievements, but the real impact was in the future they were creating, one where prejudice no longer endangered lives in emergency situations. "Remember what you told me that first night?" Wilson asked Dr. Reyes. "About hoping I'd learn from my mistake?" Dr. Reyes nodded. "Well, now the whole country is learning, and somewhere, right now, a qualified professional isn't being judged by their appearance. They're just being allowed to save lives." 3 months after the White House ceremony, Dr. Reyes and Wilson visited Michael Chen's daughter at medical school. Jessica Chen was now part of a new wave of minority students inspired by their story. "When Uncle Chen told me who really saved my dad in that cave," Jessica said, her eyes bright with admiration, "I knew I had to become part of this change." The medical school auditorium was packed with students from diverse backgrounds, all wanting to hear from the Filipino doctor who had transformed both battlefield medicine and social attitudes. "Your background doesn't limit your abilities," Dr. Reyes told them. "The same hands that performed surgery in combat can save lives in any hospital, if prejudice doesn't stop them." Wilson shared his perspective too. "I almost prevented Dr. Reyes from saving my partner because I couldn't see past his appearance. How many brilliant future doctors might we lose if we don't stop that kind of prejudice?" Jessica then revealed something that moved even Dr. Reyes. She'd started a student organization called the Cave Medics, named after the legendary Kandahar surgery that saved her father. "We're training specifically for emergency medicine in underserved areas," she explained, "using Dr. Reyes' combat techniques to save lives in places others might avoid." The students demonstrated their skills, showing how they'd adapted military medical techniques for civilian emergencies. Dr. Reyes watched proudly as his legacy evolved. "But here's what matters most," Wilson addressed the students. "Dr. Reyes didn't need combat medals to be qualified. His medical degree was enough. Don't let anyone tell you that you need extraordinary circumstances to prove your worth." After the demonstration, Jessica showed them something special, a wall of photos featuring minority medical pioneers throughout history. "Your story isn't just about one night in the ER," she told Dr. Reyes and Wilson. "It's about every qualified professional who was ever doubted because of how they looked." Dr. Reyes studied the photos, recognizing the same determination he'd carried through combat and prejudice. These students were fighting their own battles. "You know what's beautiful about this?" Wilson observed. "These students won't just save lives with their medical skills. They'll save lives by breaking down the prejudices that might have stopped them." The day ended with a surprise. Jessica had arranged for several of Dr. Reyes's former combat patients to meet with the students, sharing stories of how skill and courage transcend all barriers. Remember, Dr. Reyes told his young protégés, excellence is the best answer to prejudice. Every life you save proves them wrong. As they left the medical school, Wilson reflected on how far they'd come. From almost stopping you from saving, my partner, to helping inspire the next generation of doctors. That's what real change looks like. Late one night, 4 months after the medical school visit, Dr. Reyes received an emergency call that would test everything they'd built. Officer Wilson's daughter had been in a serious car accident and was being airlifted to a different hospital. They have a trauma surgeon there. Wilson's panicked voice came through the phone. But Dr. Reyes understood immediately. The surgeon was Filipino, and Wilson's old prejudices were fighting with his new understanding. Listen to me, James, Dr. Reyes said firmly, using Wilson's first name for the first time. Is he qualified? Yes, top of his field, but no buts. Remember what you learned. Remember what prejudice almost cost your partner. Now it could cost your daughter. There was a long pause. Then Wilson's voice came back, stronger. You're right, I'm not making that mistake again, not with my daughter's life. Dr. Reyes drove to the other hospital anyway, arriving just as Wilson's daughter was coming out of surgery. The Filipino surgeon, Dr. Santos, had performed brilliantly. I heard about you too, Dr. Santos told them. Your story helped me handle similar prejudice in my own career. Today, it helped save her life. Wilson hugged the surgeon, tears in his eyes. Thank you, not just for saving my daughter, but for being exactly what I needed to face my own lingering prejudices. Dr. Reyes watched the scene unfold. The officer who had once blocked him from treating a patient was now embracing another Filipino doctor who had saved his daughter. You know what this means? Dr. Santos asked. Your story isn't just changing policies, it's changing hearts, one emergency at a time. As Wilson's daughter recovered, more stories emerged about Dr. Santos's own battles with prejudice. Like Dr. Reyes, he had let his excellence speak louder than any bias. I almost let old fears endanger my daughter, Wilson admitted later. But your lesson stuck with me. Prejudice could have cost me everything tonight. Dr. Reyes nodded. That's why we do this work. Because somewhere, every day, prejudice threatens to delay life-saving treatment. But every time someone chooses to see past it, lives are saved. The incident became another powerful teaching moment in their training programs. Wilson now shared both stories, how prejudice almost cost him his partner and how overcoming it saved his daughter. Sometimes, Dr. Reyes told their trainees, the most powerful lessons come when we least expect them, when our new understanding is tested in the most personal ways. Dr. Santos joined their program as another voice of experience, showing that Dr. Reyes' story wasn't unique. There were qualified professionals everywhere, just waiting for prejudice to step aside and let them save lives. 5 months after Wilson's daughter's surgery, they received an unexpected invitation. The hospital where Dr. Santos had saved her was organizing a special recognition ceremony, but with a twist. We're honoring all the minority medical professionals who faced prejudice and kept saving lives anyway, the chief of surgery explained. And we want you both to speak about how understanding can replace prejudice. The ceremony hall was filled with doctors from diverse backgrounds, each with their own story of excellence, overcoming bias. Dr. Reyes and Wilson found themselves surrounded by living proof of their message. A year ago, Wilson addressed the crowd. I almost let prejudice cost 2 lives, my partner's and later almost my daughter's. Today I stand here humbled by the excellence I once doubted. Dr. Santos shared his story next, revealing how Dr. Reyes and Wilson's experience had given him strength during similar confrontations. Their story taught me that excellence doesn't just save patients, It can change minds. Then something unexpected happened. Other officers who had faced their own prejudices began standing up, sharing moments when they'd learned to see past appearances to the qualified professionals beneath. "It's not just about medicine anymore," one officer admitted. "It's about every professional we might misjudge, every expert we might doubt because of how they look." Dr. Reyes watched as the impact of their story continued to grow. The prejudice that had almost stopped him from saving Wilson's partner had sparked a movement of understanding. "But here's what matters most," Dr. Santos added. "When Officer Wilson chose to trust me with his daughter's life, he wasn't just overcoming prejudice. He was showing others it's possible." The ceremony became a powerful reunion of lives touched by their story. Medical students like Jessica Chen met experienced doctors who had faced similar challenges. Officers learned from doctors about the impact of prejudice in emergencies. "You know what's remarkable?" Wilson observed to Dr. Reyes. "A year ago I might have doubted half the people in this room. Today I see nothing but qualified professionals who save lives." Dr. Reyes nodded. "And somewhere right now, someone else is choosing to see past prejudice and let excellence speak for itself." The evening ended with a surprise announcement. The hospital was establishing a new training center, named after both Dr. Reyes and Wilson, dedicated to eliminating prejudice in emergency services. Because sometimes, the chief of surgery concluded, the most powerful medicine isn't in our instruments or drugs. It's in our willingness to see past prejudice and let qualified professionals do their jobs. As they left the ceremony, Wilson reflected on their journey. "From that night in the ER to saving my daughter's life, we've come." "So far?" "No," Dr. Reyes corrected gently. "We've just begun. Every story shared tonight is another step toward a future where prejudice doesn't delay treatment, where excellence speaks louder than bias." The impact of their experience had grown beyond anything they could have imagined. The Filipino doctor Wilson had tried to stop, and the officer who had learned to see past prejudice had started a movement that was saving lives in ways they never expected. 6 months after the recognition ceremony, Dr. Reyes and Wilson stood before a new generation of both medical students and police cadets. Their training center had become a model for combining professional excellence with prejudice awareness. "Your skills and qualifications matter more than any preconceptions," Dr. Reyes told the gathered students. "I learned that in combat. Officer Wilson learned it in an emergency, and now you'll learn it here." Wilson added his perspective, now deeply personal. "I almost lost my partner because I doubted Dr. Reyes. Then I almost doubted the surgeon who saved my daughter. Don't let prejudice make you repeat my mistakes." The training center had something unique. Medical students and police cadets trained together, learning to see past bias from the start of their careers. "Remember," Dr. Santos, now a regular instructor, explained, "every time prejudice delays treatment, lives are at risk. Your excellence is the best response to bias." They watched as diverse groups of students practiced emergency scenarios together. Future doctors and officers learning to trust each other's skills regardless of appearance. "This is what change looks like," Wilson told visiting officials. "Not just talking about overcoming prejudice, but actively practicing it when lives are at stake." Jessica Chen, now in her final year of medical school, demonstrated emergency techniques to the new students. Her Cave Medics program had spread to medical schools nationwide. "Dr. Reyes showed us that excellence speaks all languages," she told the class. And Officer Wilson proved that even the strongest prejudices can be overcome when lives are at stake. The training center had become more than just a school. It was a living testament to how excellence could defeat prejudice. Every successful scenario proved their message. "But remember," Dr. Reyes cautioned, "we're not just training for emergencies. We're training for a future where prejudice doesn't delay life-saving treatment at all. The impact of their story continued to grow. Other cities were establishing similar programs, combining medical and police training to eliminate bias-based delays in emergencies. "You know what's beautiful?" Wilson observed to Dr. Reyes. "These students will never know the prejudice I once held. They'll start their careers seeing only qualified professionals." As they watched the next generation train, both men realized their legacy would live on through these students. The Filipino doctor and the officer who learned to see past prejudice had created lasting change. "Sometimes," Dr. Reyes told the class, "the most powerful medicine is simply letting excellence speak for itself. Let your skills silence any prejudice you encounter." Their story had become more than just a lesson about overcoming bias. It was a blueprint for changing how emergency services viewed and respected qualified professionals of all backgrounds. A year after establishing the training center, Dr. Reyes and Wilson found themselves addressing Congress. Their program's success had sparked national interest in combating prejudice in emergency services. "Prejudice almost cost my partner's life," Wilson testified. "It almost made me doubt the surgeon who saved my daughter. How many others have been endangered by similar bias?" The hearing room was packed with emergency responders and medical professionals from across the country. Each had their own story of excellence overcoming prejudice. "In combat," Dr. Reyes explained, "I learned that bullets don't care about race. Neither should emergency response. Every delay caused by prejudice puts lives at risk." Medical students like Jessica Chen presented data showing how their training program had improved emergency response times. When prejudice was removed, treatment became more efficient. The CAVE Medics program now has chapters in 50 medical schools, Jessica reported. "We're training a new generation to face emergencies without letting bias slow them down." Dr. Santos shared statistics from his hospital. "Since implementing these training methods, we've eliminated delays caused by prejudice-based questioning of credentials. Lives are being saved." Wilson's daughter, fully recovered, testified about how overcoming prejudice had saved her life. "If my dad hadn't learned from Dr. Reyes, he might have questioned Dr. Santos. I might not be here." Congressional leaders were particularly interested in the program's military connection. Veterans like Captain Morrison explained how combat experience proved excellence transcends prejudice. "In that cave in Kandahar," Morrison told them, "nobody questioned Dr. Reyes's qualifications. We need to bring that same clarity to all emergency response." The hearing resulted in major funding for expanding their program nationwide. Every major city would now have a training center combining medical and police education. "But remember," Dr. Reyes cautioned the committee, "this isn't just about training. It's about changing how we view qualified professionals, regardless of their background." Wilson added his perspective. "Every time prejudice makes us question a qualified doctor, every time bias delays treatment, we risk repeating my near-fatal mistake." Their testimony was broadcast nationwide, reaching emergency rooms and police departments across America. The Filipino doctor and the officer who learned to see past prejudice were transforming emergency response at a national level. They left the capital, Wilson reflected on their journey. "From that night in the ER to testifying before Congress, we've come so far. And yet," Dr. Reyes added, "somewhere right now, prejudice is still delaying treatment. Our work continues." The impact of their program was just beginning. The story of how excellence overcame prejudice was becoming a cornerstone of emergency response training nationwide. 2 weeks after their congressional testimony, Dr. Reyes and Wilson received an unexpected invitation from the World Health Organization. Their approach to combating prejudice in emergency services had caught international attention. "Your program, addresses a universal problem, the WHO director explained via video conference. Prejudice delays emergency treatment worldwide. We want to implement your training globally. Wilson found himself addressing emergency responders from dozens of countries, each dealing with their own versions of the bias he'd once held. Prejudice speaks all languages, he told them, but so does excellence. Dr. Reyes proved that in combat, in the ER, and now we're proving it worldwide. Dr. Santos joined them, sharing how their story had already influenced international medical practice. When we eliminate prejudice-based delays, we save lives in any language. Medical students from around the world connected with Jessica Chen's Cave Medics program. The story of the surgery in Kandahar resonated across cultural boundaries. Excellence doesn't need translation, Dr. Reyes explained to the international audience. Whether in a cave in Afghanistan or an ER in America, qualified professionals deserve respect. Veterans from various nations' forces shared similar stories. How combat situations proved skill and courage transcend prejudice. How emergency response needed that same clarity. In battle, Captain Morrison told the international gathering, you learn quickly that prejudice is a luxury you can't afford. Why should civilian emergencies be different? Wilson's story of transformation particularly moved the international audience. How prejudice had almost cost his partner's life, then almost made him doubt his daughter's surgeon. These biases exist everywhere, he acknowledged, but so do qualified professionals, just waiting for prejudice to step aside and let them save lives. The WHO proposed establishing training centers based on their model in major cities worldwide. Excellence overcoming prejudice would become a global standard in emergency response. But remember, Dr. Reyes cautioned, we're not just fighting prejudice. We're proving that excellence speaks louder than bias in any culture. The international medical community embraced their message. The Filipino doctor who'd saved lives from combat zones to city ERs was helping transform emergency response worldwide. Their story crossed language barriers easily. Everyone understood the danger of letting prejudice delay life-saving treatment. You've started something remarkable, the WHO director told them. From one incident in an ER to a worldwide movement, excellence truly knows no borders. As they coordinated with international partners, both men realized their impact would reach far, beyond anything they'd imagined. The lesson that excellence defeats prejudice was becoming universal. 3 months into the international program, Wilson faced his toughest challenge yet. His father, a retired police officer with deeply ingrained prejudices, was rushed to the emergency room with a heart attack. The cardiac surgeon on call is Dr. Lee, the nurse informed them. He's one of our best. No! Wilson's father interrupted weakly. Get me someone else. Someone, you know. Wilson felt the old prejudices trying to surface, but now he knew better. Dad, remember my daughter? Remember who saved her? We're not doing this, not with your life at stake. Dr. Reyes, who happened to be at the hospital, watched his friend fight the same battle he'd once faced. The officer who had learned to see past prejudice was now teaching his own father. That surgeon, Dr. Lee, Wilson told his father firmly, is qualified to save your life. Just like Dr. Santos was qualified to save your granddaughter, just like Dr. Reyes was qualified to save my partner. The story poured out. How Wilson's prejudice had almost cost his partner's life. How learning to see past bias had saved his daughter. His father listened, even as they prepped him for surgery. Sometimes, Dr. Reyes observed quietly, the hardest prejudices to fight are the ones we learned from family. But you're breaking that cycle. Dr. Lee performed the surgery brilliantly, saving Wilson's father's life. The excellence of his work spoke louder than any prejudice. I was wrong, Wilson's father admitted during recovery. About Dr. Lee, about all of it. Watching you learn this lesson, it helped me learn it too. The incident became another powerful teaching moment in their program. Wilson now shared 3 stories: his partner, his daughter, and his father, showing how prejudice threatens lives at every level. The hardest battles, he told their trainees, aren't just in emergencies. They're in our own minds, our own families, our own learned prejudices. Dr. Reyes understood the significance. Wilson hadn't just learned to see past prejudice himself. He was now actively fighting it in the very place he'd learned it. This is how real change happens, Dr. Reyes told their students, not just in training centers or emergency rooms, but in personal moments when we choose excellence over prejudice. The story of Wilson teaching his father the same lesson he'd learned added another dimension to their program. It showed how fighting prejudice was also about healing family legacies. "You know what's remarkable?" Wilson told Dr. Reyes later. "A year ago, I was the one with fatal prejudices. Now I'm helping my own father overcome them." Dr. Lee joined their program, adding his voice to Dr. Reyes and Dr. Santos. Each represented excellence that transcended prejudice, saving lives despite bias. Their training now included this deeply personal aspect: how to face prejudice not just from strangers, but from those closest to us, how excellence speaks loudest when the stakes are highest. 1 year to the day after Wilson's father's surgery, they gathered for a special ceremony at the hospital. 3 generations of lives saved by doctors Wilson had once might have doubted. Dr. Reyes, who saved his partner, Dr. Santos, who saved his daughter, and Dr. Lee, who saved his father. "A year ago," Wilson addressed the gathered crowd, "I watched my father fight the same prejudices I once held. Today, we're both here because excellence won over bias." The ceremony was particularly meaningful because Wilson's father had become an unexpected advocate. The retired officer now spoke to police veterans about overcoming ingrained prejudices. "I spent 40 years judging people by their appearance," the elder Wilson admitted. "It almost cost me my life, almost cost my granddaughter's life, but these doctors proved excellence knows no race." Dr. Reyes watched with pride as 3 generations of the Wilson family shared their stories. Each had faced prejudice, and each had learned to see past it through excellence. From that first night in the ER, Dr. Reyes observed, to saving your daughter, to saving your father. Each time, excellence spoke louder than prejudice. The ceremony included a surprise. Officer Chen's entire family was there. His brother Michael, whose life Dr. Reyes had saved in that cave, and his niece Jessica, now a newly qualified doctor herself. "This is what changing legacy looks like," Jessica told the audience. "From a cave in Kandahar to an ER in America, excellence keeps defeating prejudice." Wilson's father had a special moment with Dr. Lee, the surgeon he'd initially rejected. "Thank you," the elder Wilson said, "not just for saving my life, but for helping me see past a lifetime of prejudice." Dr. Santos and Dr. Lee shared their own stories of facing bias, of letting their skills speak louder than prejudice. Each had contributed to transforming not just emergency response, but family legacies. "Sometimes," Dr. Reyes told their trainees, "the most powerful changes happen one family at a time, one learned prejudice overcome, one excellence recognized." The impact of their story had come full circle. From Wilson's initial prejudice to his father's transformation, they had shown how excellence could heal not just bodies, but minds. "You know what's beautiful?" Wilson reflected. "My daughter will grow up without the prejudices I learned from my father. That's how real change happens." The ceremony ended with a powerful moment. 3 generations of Wilsons thanking 3 doctors they might once have doubted. Excellence had not just saved lives, it had transformed a family's legacy. 18 months after that first night in the ER, Dr. Reyes and Wilson faced their biggest challenge yet. The police academy had asked them to completely redesign emergency response training nationwide, making their program the new standard. "We're not just changing procedures, Wilson told the Academy Board. We're changing how future officers view qualified professionals of any background. Dr. Reyes brought in an unexpected ally, Wilson's father. The retired officer's transformation, from lifetime prejudice to active advocate, had become a powerful teaching tool. I spent 40 years making the wrong assumptions, the elder Wilson told the cadets. Then 3 doctors I might have doubted saved my son's partner, my granddaughter, and my own life. The new training program was unique because it brought in all the doctors who'd proven excellence defeats prejudice. Dr. Santos shared his story of saving Wilson's daughter. Dr. Lee discussed saving his father. Each time prejudice tried to delay treatment, Dr. Santos explained, excellence proved it wrong. Every life saved is another victory over bias. They included real emergency scenarios where prejudice had endangered lives. Wilson's brutal honesty about his near-fatal mistake with Dr. Reyes became a cornerstone of the training. I almost got my partner killed, he told each class. Not because of any external threat, but because I couldn't see past my own prejudice to recognize a qualified doctor. Jessica Chen, now a full-fledged doctor, joined their program. Her perspective as both a doctor and the daughter of someone saved by Dr. Reyes added another powerful dimension. My father survived because excellence mattered more than prejudice. In that cave, she told the cadets, that same excellence saves lives in our ERs every day, if we let it. The Academy Board was particularly moved by how their program addressed generational prejudice. Through the Wilson family's story, they showed how bias could be unlearned. Think about it, the elder Wilson would say. My son learned prejudice from me, then learned to overcome it. Now my granddaughter will grow up without it. That's real change. Dr. Reyes watched as their impact expanded beyond just emergency response. They were changing how future officers approached anyone they might have prejudged. Remember, he told each class, somewhere in your career, you'll face a moment, like Officer Wilson did, a moment where prejudice tries to override professional judgment. Choose excellence. The training became known as the Reyes-Wilson Protocol, emphasizing both the importance of recognizing excellence and the courage to admit and correct prejudice. You know what makes this work? Wilson reflected to Dr. Reyes. We're not just telling them not to be prejudiced. We're showing them how prejudice endangers lives, including their own. As the program became the national standard, both men realized they'd created something that would outlast them. Future generations of officers would learn to see past prejudice from their very first day. 2 years after their first encounter in the ER, Dr. Reyes and Wilson stood before the graduating class of the police academy. This was the first class to complete their entire training under the new protocol. Look around this room, Wilson addressed. The graduates, every one of you has learned what I learned the hard way, that prejudice doesn't protect anyone. It only endangers lives. The ceremony was especially meaningful because among the graduates was Wilson's nephew, inspired by his uncle's transformation to join law enforcement. Growing up, I watched my uncle change from someone who let prejudice cloud his judgment to someone who fights prejudice every day, the young officer said. That's the kind of officer I want to be. Dr. Reyes had brought his own surprise. Several of his former combat unit members, now working in emergency services across the country. Each had their own stories of excellence defeating prejudice. In combat, one veteran explained, Dr. Reyes taught us that skill and courage have no race. Now we're teaching that same lesson in our own departments. The graduation featured a powerful demonstration, recreating the night Wilson had tried to stop Dr. Reyes from treating his partner, but this time showing how the situation should have been handled. Every time you're tempted to judge someone's qualifications by their appearance, Wilson told the graduates, remember this night. Remember how prejudice almost cost my partner's life. Jessica Chen, now running her own ER department, shared how their story had transformed medical education as well. Her Cave Medics program had become a national movement. "We're training doctors not just in medicine," she explained, "but in overcoming the prejudice they might face while saving lives." The elder Wilson watched proudly as his grandson, another cadet in training, absorbed these lessons. 3 generations of his family now stood as testimony to how prejudice could be unlearned. "My father's prejudice almost killed him," Wilson told the graduates. "My prejudice almost killed my partner, but my son and nephew will serve without those biases. That's progress." Dr. Santos and Dr. Lee were there too, each now running training and programs in their own hospitals. The network of professionals committed to defeating prejudice through excellence kept growing. "You know what's remarkable?" Dr. Reyes observed to Wilson. "That night in the ER, we were adversaries. Now we're changing how entire generations approach prejudice." The graduation ended with a powerful tradition that had become part of their protocol. Each new officer took an oath, not just to protect and serve, but to judge only by merit, never by appearance. "Remember," Wilson concluded, "somewhere in your career, prejudice will try to cloud your judgment. Choose excellence instead. Choose to see the professional, not the prejudice." As they watched the new officers celebrate, both men knew their legacy would live on through these graduates. The Filipino doctor and the officer who learned to see past prejudice had transformed not just emergency response, but the future of law enforcement itself. 2.5 years after their fateful first encounter, Dr. Reyes responded to another emergency call. A police officer had been critically injured in the line of duty, Wilson's nephew, one of their program's first graduates. "The trauma surgeon on call is Dr. Park," the ER nurse informed them. But unlike that night years ago, no one questioned the Korean doctor's qualifications. Wilson arrived at the hospital to find his nephew already in surgery. Dr. Park, like Dr. Reyes, was a highly qualified surgeon whose excellence spoke louder than any prejudice. 2 years ago, I might have doubted her," Wilson admitted to Dr. Reyes. "Now I only see a qualified professional saving my nephew's life." The waiting room filled with officers, but there was a notable difference from that first night. No one questioned Dr. Park's credentials. No one demanded a different doctor. "Your program did this," the police chief told them. "These officers, judged by qualification, not appearance. That's your legacy." Dr. Park performed brilliantly, saving Wilson's nephew's life with the same excellence Dr. Reyes had shown that first night. Excellence had once again defeated potential prejudice. "You know what made this different?" Wilson's nephew said after recovery. "No time was wasted questioning the doctor's qualifications. Every second went to saving my life instead." Dr. Reyes watched as Wilson hugged Dr. Park, thanking her with the same respect he now showed all medical professionals. The officer who had once blocked him from treating a patient had truly transformed. "From that first night to now," Dr. Reyes observed, "we've come full circle. Excellence spoke then, and it speaks now without prejudice trying to silence it." The incident became the perfect bookend to their story. From one officer's prejudice almost killing his partner, to another officer's life being saved because prejudice no longer delayed treatment. "Sometimes," Wilson told their trainees later, "the best measure of progress is what doesn't happen." No one questioned Dr. Park's qualifications. No one wasted critical time on prejudice. The story spread through their network, how the program they'd started had directly saved one of their own. Every training center now used both incidents to show the difference between then and now. "That first night, prejudice almost killed my partner," Wilson would say. "This time, the absence of prejudice helped save my nephew. That's the power of choosing excellence over bias." As they watched Wilson's nephew recover, both men knew their work had created real change. The Filipino doctor and the officer who learned to see past prejudice had transformed emergency response forever. You know what's beautiful? Wilson reflected. That first night, I was the problem. Now we're the solution. Excellence really does speak louder than prejudice, if we let it. 3 years after their first encounter, Dr. Reyes and Wilson attended the National Conference on Emergency Response. They were being honored for transforming how emergency services handle bias, but something unexpected happened. Before we begin, the conference director announced, "There's an emergency at the convention center next door. Medical professionals and first responders needed immediately." Without hesitation, Dr. Reyes and Wilson rushed to help. What they found was a scene that tested everything they'd built: multiple casualties, chaos, and a mix of emergency responders from different backgrounds. But something was different from 3 years ago. No one questioned the Filipino doctor directing trauma care. No one doubted the Chinese EMT organizing triage. Excellence was all that mattered. "Watch this," Wilson told the observers who'd followed them. "No time wasted on prejudice. Just qualified professionals saving lives." Dr. Park was there too, working seamlessly with other responders. The surgeon who'd saved Wilson's nephew now demonstrated that same excellence under pressure. 3 years ago, Wilson commented to Dr. Reyes between, "Helping victims, I would have been part of the problem. Now we're all part of the solution." The emergency response was flawless. Every professional, regardless of background, working together with one focus: saving lives. "You see," Dr. Reyes told their trainees afterward, "excellence speaks all languages. Prejudice only wastes time we don't have." The incident became another teaching moment, but this time showing how emergency response should work, rather than how prejudice could hinder it. "From that first night in the ER to today," Wilson reflected, "we've shown that excellence defeats prejudice every time, if we let it." The conference honored them not just for their program, but for demonstrating its effectiveness in real time. They had proven that changing how emergency services view qualified professionals saves lives. 3 years ago, one officer's prejudice almost cost his partner's life, the director noted. Today, we saw what happens when prejudice steps aside and lets excellence work. As they received their recognition, both men knew their work had created lasting change. The Filipino doctor and the officer who learned to see past prejudice had transformed emergency response forever. "You know what's most beautiful?" Wilson said during his acceptance speech. "Somewhere right now, lives are being saved because prejudice no longer delays treatment. That's our real achievement." 3.5 years after their first encounter, Dr. Reyes and Wilson watched Jessica Chen's graduation from her medical residency. She had become more than just a successful doctor. She was living proof of their program's impact. "When my father was saved in that cave," Jessica addressed her fellow graduates, "no one questioned Dr. Reyes' qualifications. Excellence was all that mattered. That's how emergency medicine should always work." The ceremony was particularly meaningful because among the graduates were several participants from their training program, new doctors and police officers who had learned to see past prejudice from the start. "Look at this class," Wilson told Dr. Reyes. "Every one of them starts their career knowing what I learned too late, that prejudice has no place in emergency response." The graduates demonstrated their skills in a mass casualty simulation. Doctors and officers of all backgrounds working seamlessly together, judging only by excellence. 3 years ago, Dr. Reyes observed, this same scenario might have been hindered by prejudice. Today, excellence speaks without interference. Jessica's Cave Medics program had become standard training in medical schools nationwide. Future doctors learned not just medicine, but how to let their excellence overcome any prejudice they might face. "From that cave in Kandahar to today," she told her classmates, "excellence has always spoken louder than prejudice. When we give it the chance to speak, Wilson's nephew, fully recovered and back on duty, attended to support the new graduates. His story of being saved by Dr. Park had become another testament to their program's success. 3 years ago, my uncle let prejudice almost kill his partner, he reminded them. Then he learned better, and that learning helped save my life. That's the power of choosing excellence over bias. The graduation included a special moment, the announcement of a new emergency medicine fellowship named after Dr. Reyes and Wilson. It would specifically focus on breaking down barriers of prejudice in emergency response. This fellowship, Dr. Reyes explained, isn't just about medicine. It's about ensuring excellence always speaks louder than prejudice. As they watched the new doctors take their oaths, both men knew their legacy would live on through these graduates. The Filipino doctor and the officer who learned to see past prejudice had transformed not just emergency response, but the future of medicine itself. You know what's beautiful, Wilson reflected. These graduates will never know the prejudice I once held. They'll start their careers seeing only qualified professionals. The ceremony ended with a powerful tradition, each graduate pledging to judge only by excellence, never by appearance. The next generation of emergency responders was starting without the burden of prejudice. 4 years after that fateful night in the ER, Dr. Reyes and Wilson attended the opening of a new emergency medical center. Named after both of them, it would serve as the national headquarters for their training program. This center, Wilson addressed the crowd, stands as proof that excellence defeats prejudice. 4 years ago, I almost let prejudice cost my partner's life. Today, we're saving lives by teaching others to see past bias. The facility was unique, combining an emergency department with a training center where medical professionals and law enforcement learned to work together without prejudice. Watch this, Dr. Reyes told visitors, as teams demonstrated emergency response scenarios. Notice how every second goes to saving lives, not questioning qualifications. Dr. Park and Dr. Santos were there, now running their own training programs. Each had their own stories of excellence overcoming prejudice, adding to the center's impact. 4 years ago, Dr. Park reminded trainees, prejudice might have delayed treatment. Today, excellence speaks without interference. That's progress. Wilson's father, once the source of his prejudice, now regularly spoke to groups about transformation. His journey from lifetime bias to active advocate inspired others to change. I taught my son the wrong lessons, he would say. But look what happened when he learned the right ones. Lives are being saved because prejudice no longer delays treatment. Jessica Chen had become the center's education director, expanding her Cave Medics program into a comprehensive curriculum about excellence defeating prejudice. From that cave in Kandahar to this center, she told new students, we've proven that excellence speaks all languages. Prejudice only wastes time we don't have. The center became a model for similar facilities worldwide. The story of the Filipino doctor and the officer who learned to see past prejudice was transforming emergency response globally. You know what's remarkable? Wilson reflected to Dr. Reyes. 4 years ago, I was the problem. Now we're teaching others to be the solution. Dr. Reyes watched as new generations of emergency responders trained without the burden of prejudice. Their legacy would continue saving lives long after them. Sometimes, he told their students, the best medicine isn't in our instruments or drugs. It's in our willingness to let excellence speak louder than prejudice. The center stood as living proof that emergency response could work without bias. Every life saved was another victory over the prejudice that had almost cost Wilson's partner his life. 5 years to the day after their first encounter, Dr. Reyes and Wilson returned to the exact spot in the ER where prejudice had almost cost a life. But this time, they came to witness something remarkable. 5 years ago, Wilson told the gathered staff, I stood right here and let prejudice almost kill my partner. Today, we stand here to see how much has changed. As if on cue, an emergency call came in. Multiple casualties from a major accident. The response was everything they'd worked to achieve. Doctors and officers of all backgrounds worked seamlessly together. No time wasted on prejudice, no credentials questioned, just excellence saving lives. "Watch this," Wilson told the observers. "Every second that prejudice once wasted now goes to saving lives instead." Dr. Park was leading trauma response, Dr. Santos coordinating with EMTs. The doctors Wilson had once might have doubted now demonstrated flawless emergency care. 5 years ago, Dr. Reyes observed, prejudice would have delayed treatment. Today, excellence speaks without interference. Jessica Chen was there too, now a senior emergency physician herself. The daughter of the soldier Dr. Reyes saved in combat had become proof that excellence transcends generations. From that cave, in Kandahar to today, she told new residents, we've proven that excellence speaks louder than prejudice if we let it. Wilson's father watched proudly as his son and Dr. Reyes showed visitors their training program in action. 3 generations of transformed attitudes saving lives together. 5 years ago, the elder Wilson reflected, I taught my son prejudices that almost got his partner killed. Today, I watch him teach others to see past those same prejudices. The emergency response was perfect, every professional, regardless of background, working together with one focus, saving lives. You know what's beautiful? Wilson said to Dr. Reyes as they watched the teams work. This is exactly where prejudice almost won. Now it's where excellence wins every day. Their legacy had come full circle. The Filipino doctor and the officer, who learned to see past prejudice, had transformed the very place where their story began. Sometimes, Dr. Reyes told their trainees, the most powerful changes happen right where they're needed most. Excellence defeats prejudice every time, if we give it the chance. The ER stood as living proof that emergency response worked best without bias. Every life saved was another victory over the prejudice that had almost cost everything that night 5 years ago. 6 years after their first encounter, Dr. Reyes and Wilson found themselves at the White House. The president was recognizing their work with the Presidential Medal of Freedom, but the ceremony took an unexpected turn. Before we begin, the president announced, there's been an emergency on the grounds, multiple casualties requiring immediate response. Without hesitation, Dr. Reyes, Wilson, and their trained teams sprang into action. The response demonstrated everything they'd built over 6 years. Dr. Park led trauma care, Dr. Santos coordinated triage, Jessica Chen managed emergency response. Excellence flowed without a single second lost to prejudice. Watch this, Wilson told the gathered dignitaries. 6 years ago, prejudice would have wasted critical time. Today, only excellence matters. The president himself watched in amazement as professionals of all backgrounds worked seamlessly together, saving lives with flawless precision. This, Dr. Reyes explained between treating patients, is what emergency response looks like without prejudice. Every second goes to saving lives. Wilson's father, now a vocal advocate for their program, proudly watched his son work alongside the doctor he'd once doubted. 3 generations of changed attitudes in action. 6 years ago, the elder Wilson told observers, my prejudices almost cost lives. Today, I watch as those same prejudices fall to excellence. The emergency response was perfect, proving their program's impact at the highest level of recognition. Excellence had truly defeated prejudice. You know what's most powerful? Wilson said to Dr. Reyes as they finished treating patients. This wasn't staged. Excellence just naturally won over prejudice. After the emergency was handled, the ceremony took on deeper meaning. They weren't just receiving medals, they were proving why they deserved them. Today, the president said, we honored these men for transforming emergency response. Then they showed us exactly why they deserve that honor. The medals recognized not just their program, but the real changes it had created. Every life saved was another victory over the prejudice that had almost cost everything that night 6 years ago. Sometimes, Dr. Reyes told the audience, the best recognition isn't in medals or ceremonies. It's in watching excellence defeat prejudice every single day. Their White House experience became another powerful teaching moment, showing how emergency response should work at every level, from local ER to national crisis. 7 years after their first encounter, Dr. Reyes and Wilson organized a special reunion. They gathered everyone whose lives had been touched by their story. From that first night in the ER to their latest successes. Wilson's partner, the first, life almost lost to prejudice, stood healthy beside Dr. Reyes. Wilson's daughter saved by Dr. Santos, now training to be a doctor herself. Wilson's father saved by Dr. Park, teaching others about overcoming prejudice. 7 years ago, Wilson addressed the gathered crowd, "My prejudice almost cost my partner's life. Today, we celebrate not just the lives saved, but the prejudices overcome." One by one, people shared their stories. Officers who had learned to see past bias, doctors who could now practice without interference, patients who had received care without delay. "Watch this," Dr. Reyes told observers, as teams demonstrated their current emergency response protocols. "Notice how excellence flows without a single second lost to prejudice." Jessica Chen presented the impact of her Cave Medics program, now standard in medical schools nationwide. Excellence defeating prejudice in the next generation. "From that cave in Kandahar to today," she explained, "we've proven that excellence speaks all languages. Prejudice only wastes time we don't have." Dr. Park and Dr. Santos shared their experiences running training programs, showing how excellence naturally overcame prejudice when given the chance. 7 years ago, Dr. Park reminded everyone, prejudice might have delayed treatment. Today, excellence speaks without interference. The reunion became a powerful demonstration of their program's impact. Every person there represented a victory over the prejudice that had almost cost everything that night. "You know what's beautiful?" Wilson said to Dr. Reyes as they watched families mingle. "Every person here represents countless others whose lives were saved because prejudice no longer delays treatment." The gathering proved their legacy would live on through these people and their stories. The Filipino doctor and the officer who learned to see past prejudice had created lasting change. Sometimes, Dr. Reyes told the group, the most powerful moments aren't in emergencies or ceremonies. They're in seeing how excellence defeats prejudice every day in ways big and small. Their reunion stood as living proof that emergency response worked best without bias. Every life represented was another victory over prejudice. 8 years after their fateful first encounter, Dr. Reyes and Wilson attended the graduation of the first medical school class, fully trained under their program. These students had never known emergency response hindered by prejudice. 8 years ago, Wilson told the graduates, "I let prejudice almost kill my partner. Today you enter your careers knowing only excellence matters." The ceremony was particularly meaningful because Wilson's daughter was among the graduates. The young woman whose life Dr. Santos had saved was now becoming a doctor herself. "When Dr. Santos saved my life," she told her classmates, "no one questioned his qualifications. That's the world we'll practice in, where excellence speaks louder than prejudice." Dr. Park and Dr. Santos watched proudly as their students demonstrated emergency response protocols. Each graduate represented the future they'd fought to create. 8 years ago, Dr. Park reminded everyone, prejudice delayed treatment. Today, excellence works without interference. Jessica Chen, now running her own medical department, presented the next evolution of their program. Excellence defeating prejudice was becoming medical tradition. From that cave in Kandahar to today, she explained, we've proven that excellence speaks all languages. These graduates will continue that legacy. Wilson's father watched his granddaughter receive her medical degree, tears in his eyes. 3 generations of transformed attitudes now saving lives together. 8 years ago, the elder Wilson reflected, my prejudices almost cost lives. Today, I watch my granddaughter become part of the solution. The graduation became a powerful symbol of their program's future. These new doctors would never know emergency response hindered by prejudice. You know what's beautiful? Wilson said to Dr. Reyes as they watched the ceremony. These graduates will only know a world where excellence defeats prejudice naturally. Their legacy would live on through these new doctors. The Filipino doctor and the officer who learned to see past prejudice had transformed medicine forever. Sometimes, Dr. Reyes told the graduates, the most powerful changes happen in the next generation. You'll practice medicine without the burden of prejudice we had to overcome. The graduation stood as living proof that emergency medicine worked best without bias. Every new doctor represented another victory over the prejudice that had almost cost everything that night, 8 years ago. 10 years to the day after their first encounter, Dr. Reyes and Wilson stood in the exact spot where prejudice had almost cost a life. The ER had been renamed the Reyes-Wilson Emergency Center, but they weren't there for ceremonies. A major emergency had brought them back, multiple casualties requiring immediate response. But this time, something beautiful happened. Every professional, regardless of background, worked in perfect harmony. Dr. Park led trauma care, Dr. Santos coordinated triage, and Wilson's daughter, now a resident, worked alongside them all. Watch this, Wilson told new trainees observing the response. 10 years ago, prejudice would have wasted critical time. Today, only excellence matters. Jessica Chen, running her own ER department, joined the effort. The daughter of the soldier doctor, Reyes saved in combat, now saved lives alongside him. From that cave in Kandahar to today, she said between treating patients, we've proven that excellence speaks all languages. Prejudice only wastes time we don't have. Wilson's father watched proudly as 3 generations worked together. His son coordinating with Dr. Reyes, his granddaughter treating patients, excellence flowing without a single second lost to prejudice. 10 years ago, the elder Wilson reflected, my prejudices almost cost lives. Today, I watch them save lives without those barriers. The emergency response was flawless, proving how far they'd come. Every professional focused solely on saving lives, excellence speaking without interference. You know what's most beautiful? Wilson said to Dr. Reyes as they finished treating the last patient. This is exactly where prejudice almost won. Now, it's where excellence wins every day. Their legacy had come full circle. The Filipino doctor and the officer who learned to see past prejudice had transformed emergency medicine forever. Sometimes, Dr. Reyes told their trainees, the most powerful changes happen right where they're needed most. 10 years ago, prejudice almost cost a life here. Today, excellence saves lives without hesitation. As they looked around the ER they'd transformed, both men knew their work would continue through others. Every life saved was another victory over the prejudice that had almost cost everything that night 10 years ago. 10 years, Wilson reflected. From me trying to stop you from saving my partner, to this, excellence defeating prejudice so naturally that new doctors will never know it any other way. The ER stood as living proof that emergency medicine worked best without bias. Excellence had truly defeated prejudice, creating lasting change for generations to come.